So hello everyone, I am Advaith and welcome back to my channel Subodha. Today we'll be starting the second chapter in Civics, that is understanding secularism. So let's look at what we have ahead of us in this chapter. It will go something like this. First, we'll understand what secularism is. Next, we'll be looking at why it's important. After which, we'll be looking at the aims of Indian secularism. Then, we'll be looking at how secularism is achieved in India. Finally, we'll be looking at how Indian secularism is different from other forms of secularism in other nations. So without further ado, let's begin. So firstly, what do we mean by the term secularism? As we discussed in the previous chapter, it means the separation of religion from the state being the three organs within a country: the legislative, executive, and the judiciary. So, the separation of religion from these three organs is termed as secularism. Now, let's understand why it's so important. In a country like India, there are people who belong to a lot of different religions. Ensuring the rights of all of these religions is extremely important to make sure that the majority does not dominate the minority, a common theme that we saw even in the previous chapter. So, to ensure that the majority religion does not dominate the minority, secularism in a country like India is very important. The second is fundamental rights. If you remember, one of the fundamental rights in the previous chapter was the right to freedom of religion, which means that a person is free to choose whichever religion they want. And so, to ensure that this fundamental right is upheld, secularism is important. So now, let's understand the aims of Indian secularism. There are three aims in our secularism. The first is the separation of the state or the government from the religion. The second is ensuring that a majority religion does not dominate a minority religion. And the third is ensuring that a majority within a particular religious group does not dominate a minority within the same religious group. So the first thing that we saw, the separation of state from religion, is enforced everywhere. In places like government schools or police offices, you will never find idols of gods of any particular religion. Instead, you'll find the portraits of freedom fighters. So now, let's understand how the Indian government or the three organs enforce all of these forms of secularism. Well, the first is distancing. The government makes sure that it is as far away from religious aspects as possible. This is evidenced in government schools, as certain religious festivals are not allowed to be celebrated in government schools, so that the state or the government in this case is not endorsing any particular religion. The second is the concept of non-interference. This is evidenced by the fact that Sikhs are not mandated to wear a helmet while riding a bike or a scooter. That is because their religious turban or the pagadi is very, very important to them and they cannot remove it. So, they are not mandated to wear a helmet. In this case, the state is not interfering with the religious practices of the Sikhs. And finally, the most interesting of all is interference. This is something extremely unique to Indian secularism. So what do we mean by interference? And how can non-interference and interference coexist in a country? In the case of interference, religious practices like untouchability, which are social evils, are abolished by the government. In this case, the government is interfering in certain religious practices. And hence, they are making sure that there is no social injustice. Now, interference and non-interference can coexist at the same time because they apply to different conditions. Non-interference is when something is a basic religious sentiment, whereas interference is when the concept of that religion is taken too far and something becomes a social evil. So that is the important difference between interference and non-interference and when they happen. Now, let's understand the final and most important thing of all. How is Indian secularism different from the secularism in other countries? Well, let's take two examples, the United States and France. In the case of the USA, secularism means complete separation of the state from religion. That means that neither the church, that is the religion, can interfere with the state nor vice versa. That means they're both completely different entities and cannot even maintain contact with each other in any point of time. This, however, does not hold for the case of India. As we have just seen, interference is a major aspect of Indian secularism and its enforcement. So, that is the first difference between foreign secularism and Indian secularism, the presence of interference. Let's look at the second case study, that is of France. In France, there is complete interference. This is evidenced by the fact that in 2004, France banned any religious symbols being worn to public places or schools. Now, this meant that no one was allowed to wear what was theirs in their religion. So, in this case, France was completely interfering with the religion of the people. This is, however, not true once again for India, as we have just seen in the case of Sikhs and the religious pagadi. Because of that, they're not mandated to wear a helmet. In the case of France, there is complete interference. It is different from Indian secularism, as in Indian secularism, non-interference is also a major aspect. So those are the two differences between Indian secularism and foreign secularism. The first is the existence of interference against the complete lack of interference and complete lack of contact between the state and religion in the United States, for example. The second is the complete interference in the case of France versus certain cases of non-interference with rational beliefs in religions in India. So those are the two major differences. And with that, we have finished this chapter. It was a very short chapter, I understand, but it is a very important chapter all throughout CBSE and NCERT social studies, especially civics. So I hope that all of you understood the concept, and I'll see you in the next chapter of civics. Till then, thank you.